So James Terry Sherwin, born in New York on October 25th, 1933, he became an international master after this tournament. In 1951, he won the New York State Chess Championship. He tied for first place in the 1954-55 Manhattan Chess Club Championship. He won the first Eastern Open Chess Championship in Washington, D.C. in 1960. In 61, he was the chairman of the USCF Rules Committee, and he was the American Chess Foundation president from 1979 to 1990. Professionally, he was the executive vice president of the GAF Corporation. He now lives near Bath, England. In August of 2019, in Torquay, at age 86, he tied for first place in the rapid play event at the British Championships. At 86 years old. 2 months ago, December 2023, age 90, he finished 6th place at the Bristol Blitz tournament. Not bad. So he's still alive and well. Playing that well at 90. I hope I'm still that good. Well, I'll never be that good. What do I mean still that good? I meant to say, I hope I'll be as good as I am now if I live to be 90. That's really what I meant to say. So to the game. We have e4 from Bobby Fischer, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and of course bishop b5, the Ruy Lopez opening. We have Morphy's defense with a6. Bishop a4 is your Columbus variation, knight f6. We have kingside castles, and bishop e7 is your closed Spanish. Rook e1, now pawn b5, bishop b3, and pawn to d6. That's your deferred Steinitz defense. c3 makes way for the bishop to come to c2. Black castles his king behind his pawns. That's where the king loves to be. h3 prevents any occupation of the g4 square. Now a5 is not the usual approach. Well, usual's not quite the right word. It's not the most common approach. Let's put it that way. The most frequently played move is knight a5, which is in Keres variation, named for Alcaraz, the Estonian great. And that's much more frequently played, and that's followed by bishop c2, c5, d4, and queen c7 is Mikhail Chigorin's defense. Queen's knight to d2, bishop pawn takes the pawn takes the pawn, knight back to c6 is Panov's system. Then knight b3, a5, now bishop e3, showing the book line. a4 pushes the knight back to d2. Bishop d7, rook c1, queen b7, and knight f1. In the most frequently played response to that is rook f e8. Also, you can get queen e2 here, which is also answered by rook f e8. All of those are book moves. I'll show you another line that is not uncommon. Definitely more common than the a5 line that Sherwin played here is Breyer's defense, which returns the knight to its home square. It's second most commonly played, and after d4, we get the queen's knight coming to d7, and that's the Zaitsev hybrid variation. That line continues with queen's knight to d2, bishop to b7, bishop to c2, rook to e8, knight to f1, bishop to f8, getting out of the way of the rook, knight to g3, pawn to g6, pawn to a4, then c5 is finally played here, and then d5 puts the stop sign up against that bishop, c4, bishop g5 pinning the knight, h6 kicks the bishop back to e3. All theory, all ECO. Knight c5, queen d2, pawn h5, bishop back to g5 in this line, bishop e7, and rook a3. And then the most frequent response to that, leaving the ECO, is king's knight to d7. There's one other reliable line that is even more popular than the one played by Sherwin here, and that is the floor decisive system that begins with bishop b7. And that's answered by d4, rook e8, queen's knight d2, bishop f8, a lot of the same ideas. a3, h6 introduces Smyslov into the equation. This is known as the Smyslov-Breyer-Zaitsev hybrid system. And bishop c2, and here's the Breyer portion, knight b8, pawn b4, knight b d7, bishop b2, and g6. So all three of those lines are more common than the line played by Jim Sherwin here. He went with pawn a5. Now d3 by Bobby is not in the ECO. The ECO move here is a4, preventing the black A-man from occupying a4. Typically on a4, black will play b4. But this game, d3 was played, opening the door for the queen's bishop. And Sherwin does not exploit the opportunity to play to a4, which would certainly be, in my mind, the better move. It's definitely the more popular move. Instead, he played bishop b7, and the bot didn't like that. It gave him an inaccuracy right there. Instead, a4 is the most popular move. Bishop c2, bishop d7, queen's knight d2, and you get a lot of the same ideas as the other lines that I showed. So James Sherwin with bishop b7 here. And Bobby, since Sherwin did not play a4, Bobby should play a4 right here, keeping black's pawn at bay. But instead, he went with the queen's knight to d2 and gets a full question mark on that. And Sherwin does not pass up the next opportunity to play a4, bishop c2, knight b8 here, following after Breyer. My preference would be the rook e8 move, which is thematic, or attacking in the center with pawn to d5. But Sherwin with the knight b8, we call it the Breyer move. Knight f1, c5, d4, c takes d4, c takes d4, now knight back to c6. Here knight g3 is played, very thematic. g6, the purpose of g6 is to keep the white knight from playing to f5. But I don't like the weakness created by g6. In fact, it invites bishop to h6 right here. In fact, I'm surprised that we don't see bishop to h6 right here. We see bishop d2. But I preferred here pawn takes the pawn. And the reason is it opens the e-file for when the rook does come to e8. Well, as mentioned, Bobby did not play bishop h6. He played bishop d2. And here rook e8. Now, more appropriate again is to take this pawn. Although now for sure I would think bishop h6 would be played, followed by rook e8. But rook e8 he played, and d5, hitting the knight, knight a5. Pawn b3 keeps the knight from coming to the c4 square. Bishop c8, pawn takes the a-man, 2 attackers, 3 attackers really, count the queen. So after pawn take pawn, bishop takes pawn. Bishop d7 interposes, and bishops are traded on d7. Knight captures, opening the d8 h4 diagonal for this bishop. Bishop to b4 says, don't you dare move that bishop. Queen b6 says, I'll move the bishop, and I'll defend my pawn and hit your bishop. Liberating my bishop is really what I meant to say. a3 defends my bishop, and knight c5 was actually played here, which facilitates greater mobility for the knight. But with this open file, my preference would be to get your rook on c8. You may even want to get your this knight, in a better place. This knight is worse than the knight on d7, so another option would be knight b7. Knight c5 was played, and queen to e2. Well, speaking of getting a rook on an open file, I like to put my rook on c1 here. Queen e2 was the choice, and I gather that was really played to keep the black queen from coming to b5. Because Sherwin now plays rook e b8, preparing queen b5. Now, I didn't care for that idea either. I'd rather take this bad knight and improve it to b3 that comes with a hit on the rook and potentially a place on the d4 square, which would in turn hit the queen. Now, I do recognize that d4 is presently covered, but my idea, I open a line for my rook, I improve my knight, I hit my opponent's rook, all in one move. Sherwin went with rook e b8, Bobby with knight d2. Speaking of this threat against b3, no doubt this was meant to discourage occupation of the b3 square. You can also simply move your rook now prophylactically. But knight d2 was played, and Sherwin said, I'm going to b3 anyway, hitting your rook and compelling a knight trade. So knight takes the knight, knight takes the knight, and now rook a b1. And it seems to come out in the washing machine, and you'll remember what I said about the value of the knight coming to b3 is that it can then come to d4, and that's what Sherwin plays here. Queen d3 moves to safety, queen a6 puts the question to our undefended queen, and that question is answered with a trade. Queen takes queen, rook takes queen. Bobby lifts his rook, making way for the other to come behind and simultaneously preventing the knight from coming to the c2 square. Sherwin doubles his rooks on the a file, and Bobby did not double his rooks, nor did he play to the open file. I think I'd be very inclined myself to play rook c1. Instead, he went with rook a1. Rook a4 from Sherwin, knight to f1, knight b5. Now we have 3 attackers on the A-man and only 2 defenders. Bobby says you can have my A-man and plays bishop to d2. So that A-man is accepted with rook takes the pawn, rook takes the rook, knight takes the rook. Rook b7 hits the undefended bishop. You could also note this piece relationship and pin the knight with rook a2. And an attack on the pinned piece can come from the bishop on the following turn. You could also consider getting this knight back into the game right here, because the knight on the rim, after all, is dim, and the knight on e3 would keep our opponent's knight from forking our rook and bishop from the c4 square. So those options rejected in favor of rook b7 hitting the bishop. King f8 defends, knight e3 now is played, and rook c8. Bobby played f3 here, shoring up his central pawn. I thought it might be interesting to put the question to his opponent's knight, and it pretty much forces his knight to come to c2, because knight c4 would end up with a pin, well, a soft pin. The knight could come back and defend. But more likely knight c2, and after knight takes knight, rook takes knight, the bishop to h6 check, and black must play precisely. King g8 is a self-mate, so he'd have to come here. Note, king g8 loses immediately. You can throw away a piece and then another piece, but that's checkmate. Bobby with f3 here on move 38. h5, bishop b4, knight c2. Rook c1 check was also a move. king f2 would have to be played. And then in my opinion, in my own opinion, rook b1 would be worthy of a double exclam. Back, back, back. Unfortunately, we don't have the analysis bot to confirm whether or not my assessment is correct. So here, knight takes knight, rook takes knight, and we get a rook bishop versus rook bishop endgame. White with the slightly, ever so slightly better position, only because his bishop is slightly better than the black bishop. The black bishop really boxed in by his own pawns at the moment. Rook b6 is played, super attacking this pawn. King e8, and we win the pawn with bishop takes the pawn, bishop takes the bishop, rook takes the bishop, and white enjoys one extra pawn, and it's a passed pawn. However, this should still be drawn if played correctly. Sherwin with h4, rook a6, rook c1 check, king to h2, pawn g5, rook a2, then rook f1. I'm not real sure what the idea of rook f1 is, to be honest. Rook a6 here. I was thinking rook a7 comes with the idea of keeping the king contained and perhaps playing pawn d6 followed by rook e7 check, forking the king in this weak pawn. But rook a6, Bobby's move. Rook d1, getting behind the passed pawn. Rooks belong behind passed pawns. Rook b6, king e7, rook b2, rook f1. A lot of dancing around here. Rook b3. I didn't see the point of that move. Rook d1. I honestly don't see the point of a lot of these moves. I didn't really care for this move, g4. It didn't make sense to me. It does lock these pawns in place, but it makes two backward pawns instead of one backward pawn. So I thought another rook move would have been in order. Rook c3 or rook b6 and keep that one weak pawn where it is. But g4, Bobby's choice. Rook d2 check kind of punctuates the problem with pawn g4. King g1, rook d1. I didn't really understand why he's giving up the h-pawn and giving his opponent a passed pawn. He played rook d2 check here, king e3, and then rook h2. So this pawn will drop. That becomes a passer. Bobby with rook b7 check, king f6, rook b6 check, king e7, and they did a couple of repetitions. Most likely this is actually just a mechanical repetition to increment the move counter to satisfy the time control. Very common technique by master level players. So king f6, rook back to b6, right? King e7, oh yeah, okay, and now rook h6. Rook does take h3, d6 check is played, king d7 played. Now rook f6. Rook h2, rook takes the pawn check, king takes the pawn on d6. Rook f6 check, king e7, and rook g6. Pawn h3, rook takes g5, king e6. I thought, why not? Okay, king e6 defends the pawn. I understand that. But why not defend and attack? I guess the point is you'd have to come back to e6 anyway, right? Anyway, king e6 was played, rook h5, king f6 now, king d3. You could probably give a check here and force the king back to e6 and maybe push the pawn and get into this kind of a situation. And if check is given, we come here to conquer the passer. Or do we? Right. If he gives check, we come here. And then if he pushes here, we cannot take that, or he gets the queen. We have to come here. And then we're there just in time. We'll win that pawn. Okay. Anyway, king d3 was played, king g6, rook h8. notice he did not take that pawn right there. That gives you 3 pawns, but it could get a little touchy with this pawn. I don't know. I could get behind it. Rook h1. If I play rook h5, h2, oh yeah, and then you got this. Yeah, best not to grab that pawn there. So rook h8 is the right move. King g7 hits the rook, rook to h4. This keeps out of the range of the king. No repetitions or anything like that. King g6 is played anyway. Oh, and now rook h5, king f6. I'm not really sure, to be honest, what difference these moves make, one or another. King e3, king e6, pawn f4 at last. We have the E-man under super attack. I mean, you could, if you needed to increment, you could always play rook h6 again. But he goes for the break. Pawn takes the pawn, and king takes the pawn. Now rook h1. If you play rook f2 check, that's going to be answered by king g3. Oh, well, then I could play rook e2. You take my pawn, I'll take yours. And that should still be drawn. Let's go back. Rook h1, king g3 anyway. Now rook e1. So you get the same exact thing. You get the same position either way. King takes and rook takes. That gives us less than 6 pieces, which puts us in the table base. And the table base is calling this position drawn. Rook f5, rook a4, rook f8, king e7, rook f3, and now king e6 is a table base blunder. After this, the table base says checkmate in 33 moves by force or less. In order to maintain the draw, there's one and only one move that the table base calls for, and that's rook a8. The problem with king to e6 is it allows king to h4, and now rook a8 comes a move too late because g5. Rook h8 check, king g4, king e7, pawn g6, rook f8, hoping for a trade. Rook f8, king f8, and the pawn can't promote. So rook f5 was played instead, and that is the only move, according to the table base, that wins. Any other move, and black can draw. So rook h8. And of course, you understand we're going for Lucena position. King g5, rook h1, rook f2, rook h3, pawn g7, and now rook g3 check, king h6, rook h3 check, king g6, rook g3 check, king h7, rook h3 check, king g8. And black resigned. Bobby has achieved Lucena's position. The table base tells us this is forced mate in 21 moves. By the way, Lucena's position is named for Luis Ramirez de Lucena, who lived from 1465 to 1530. He was a Spanish chess player that published the oldest existing chess book, the oldest surviving chess book. So, how do we win from this position? If black does not resign, it's important to know this technique from Lucena's position. First, it's important that the king is shouldered away from the pawn. So he's going to keep his king as close to this as possible. It keeps our king from getting out of the way of our pawn, which means he's going to maintain a presence on the H file. But as soon as he does, we're going to use our king's shouldering ability to force his king off to the d7 or d6 squares. And the point is, he can't come here, or we just step, and his own king is his barrier. If he were to come here, we just step on over. And his own king becomes the barrier to his rook giving check. So he has to come in this direction. Now with his king away, we lift our rook to e4. The rook keeps the king away from our pawn. We're going to bring our rook over only at the right moment. You want it on the 4th rank, because after, let's say he plays king d6 here, then you bring your king out, and now these checks become irrelevant. You bring your king to g6, And then after rook g1, king back to f6, maintaining the defense of the pawn. And rook f1 check, now king g5. And that's why you wanted your rook on e4. So after rook g1, rook g4, and there's no more stopping the pawn from promotion, and the king is too far away to get to the square that would stop it. And that is how you convert Lucenia's position into victory. Doesn't matter what he does here. Well, I mean, unless he trades rooks, but, you know, he's still too late. So I hope that last part was helpful to you. You may need that someday, Lucenia's position. Let's come back to the Lucenia's position. You'll note the keys to Lucenia's position is the pawn ready to promote at the right moment, but we got to get our king out of check. So the pawn's behind our king, and our rook is cutting off his king. So he's going to maintain a presence on the h-file, and that's when you use your rook to send his king off to the side. But this position is known as Lucenia's, written about in the aforementioned book that still survives.